Are you tired of running a ZHP Hexblast Trickster? Well, do I have the build for you? So currently I'm running a different iteration with CI and Ghost Reaver, and this will allow you to be able to jump into T17s, not just having 12,000 EHP with no defensive mitigation, and I'm going to demonstrate how this build functions in a T17, and just to illustrate, this is going to be a boss rush to show how the defenses and the offenses feel in such a T17 map, and this is a T17 with full map effect. So after this map, I'll jump into the details of the defenses of the build, things you can look out for, and you hardly take any damage in these maps with the amount of energy shield that you have, with the leech that you have, and the mitigation that the build has as well. So just running to the boss very quickly over here, I'll just run straight there. And you can see that the gameplay just involves shield charging, frost blinking, throwing your mines, and blasting them down. Just waiting for the phase. And the trick of the build is having enough defenses while still having the extreme offenses that a normal Hexblast Trickster miner would have. So without further ado, let's jump into the build. So Hexblast, if you guys didn't know, I had a video covering the tips and tricks, which cover how to solve for the mana flask issue. I do not like using the mana flask every single map, every other second, and yeah, this is something that I immediately wanted to solve when it comes to building this build. A lot of the builds out there have a mana flask just to solve mana issues, and for me, that was a non-negotiable. I want to just sit back, relax, blast my mats with as few buttons as possible. And the second issue was solving for dexterity, which I covered in the video as well, and solving for crit with the details over here within each of these sections. So for today, we'll be covering over the CI Ghost Reaver variant, and the minimum requirement, in my opinion, just as a disclaimer, is that it will have a decent amount of investment. And that means you needing a mageblood, at least 5,000 plus ES after the transition, which means you'll need a good chest and a good shield, which are not exactly cheap. And minimum, the amount of passes required is going to be a level 97 build. As for the defenses, you can see that the hit mitigation is extremely good at 84% of grace, with evasion at 45,000 on this build. Not too difficult to hit with a good chest, as well as mageblood with a jade flask and evasion suffix. And as for chaos damage, completely nullified, extremely good for T17s because there are a lot of alter modifiers and map modifiers that deal poison damage from arch nemesis monsters with the poison orbs following you, poison to hit modifiers, phys chaos damage taken per second, exarch altars. All of these are completely free with CI. And next is the main gimmick of the build, which is going to be the machina mids, allowing you to leech. And you can see the modifier machina mids, which says damage dealt by your mines is leeched to you as life, and that is the main mechanic that we're dealing with. So ghost shrouds I'll get to in just a second, which is a defensive layer that is often overlooked when it comes to how much you're getting, but you can see that it doesn't give you any EHP in POE, but in practice it gives you a lot, which is 3% of evasion on hit to be recovered immediately. And the machina mids allows you to do 1.2k leech. You can see on the build right now, giving you an ES leech on hit rate of 1.2k with the current amount of energy shield that we have. And on top of that, giving you 183 stationary ES regen. I felt like it would be good on top of the leech to have some regen just in case that we do not get that. And we get that through the Savor the Moment cluster jewel. For actually on bosses or single target that you need to just stand and ramp, gives you a lot of effective health pool, and on top of that, if you are not crit capped, this will give you crit as well. But for our build, we're already crit capped, so this just gives us the 4,300 additional effective hit pool on top of the 6,000 plus and the overleech that we are having. So we're extremely tanky build when it comes to single target, and I'll show an Uber in just a second. On top of that, in softcore, I opted for Lucky Suppress, which is a more efficient way of building to occasionally have damage go through, and that is fine. We can tank it, and we also constructed in a way with have a non-negligible amount of spell block at 22%. Nothing too crazy, but it's just an additional defensive layer. And a greatly overlooked defense here is that doesn't show up is the freeze that Hexblast does. So on crit, you can see that Hexblast allows you to be able to freeze, shock, and ignite, and you essentially are shattering every single monster in the map if you don't have avoid ailments or movement speed cannot be lowered below 0 in your T17s. Last but not least, ailment immunity through the use of Storm Shroud and the avoid shock on the boots allows us to be able to be ailment immune completely. Some alternatives that I actually thought of in the build is to be able to go Spellbreaker instead of the Overleech, but I believe the Overleech in softcore is going to be the go-to for Uber bosses. I can imagine Spellbreaker being exceptionally good and being able to trigger Wicked Ward during the fight, on top of taking less spell damage, of course. Yeah, and instead of Overleech jewels, if you have a lower budget, you can just use ES, any form of ES jewel with some damage or useful modifiers that could help the build. And another thing that I noticed in the build is that the starting nodes here are very efficient when it comes to pathing. So taking these nodes allows you to get another 400 energy shield at this stage of the build. It's currently in a level 99 or 98 POB. And taking those nodes will help you boost your energy shield further if you feel like you need more effective hit pull. But of course that comes at a trade-off of probably some of the offenses or quality of life when it comes to mana regeneration. Another thing I noticed is that the flask currently I'm running T17s, I'm using rarity suffix flask just because you get more gold, get more loot, why not? But you can of course swap it out for a better defensive enchant, and that is going to be leech, 15% of damage leech's life on hit. So this gives you some recovery when it comes to on hit mechanics, and you'll get some energy shield leech, which the life on hit leeched will be converted using the Ghost Reaver, allowing you to get some recovery on hit, a bit like recover life on block, for example, in that fashion. And on top of that, we also have the machina mitts with frenzy as a different option, because currently we're using ally weakness on hit gloves, allowing us to trigger the ally weak on hit after the Hexblast is triggered using the profane proxy. But in my opinion, frenzy is going to be more damage, and if you have a GG ring with either an implicit with ally weakness on hit or an affix on an influence ring with ally weak on hit, that will be a really good option. And of course, frenzy ally weak on hit machina is the jackpot. There are two alternative tree pathings, but solving for the 4th utility flask requires sufficient mana regen, and the current pathing to the bottom side solves that mana regeneration problems, having enough mana to throw without needing a mana flask. The alternative pathings will be going down to the frenzy nodes over here, possibly taking the crit and opening up suppression as well. And the other pathing, which solves dex, and the other pathing is going to be pathing through the top, stacking a little bit more of the power charges and going for the ES unnatural calm. But solving for mana will be slightly trickier in that scenario. As for the build cost, it is slightly expensive. The build is done in Necro Settlers League, where I'm playing right now. A lot of the crafts are self-made. When it comes to the rares, the chest, the wand, the amulet, most of it are all self-crafted. And the bases that I bought were either picked up from the ground to alt-spam recom or are extremely cheap. The plus 1 fracture that I bought on day 3 was only 3 divines. And then I just started crafting on top of that as a daily project to finish each of the pieces of gear. As for the uniques, the mandatory uniques in my opinion are going to be mageblood to start out the CI build, machina mitts with ally weak, profane proxy, storm shroud, sandstorm, and balance of terror, all of which are fairly expensive, but some of the uniques now are slightly cheaper, I think. As for the non-mandatory uniques, currently I'm using the Forbidden Flame and Flesh to allow us to have Overleech when it comes to throwing our mines, which synergizes very well with the Ghost Reaver Machina Mitts combination, and this gives us a lot of additional defenses that I mentioned earlier. For the Bottle of Faith, this is something optional. The last flask can be anything you want. This could be a mana flask and you completely ignore the mana regen that you need, but of course you need to press it every 7 to 8 seconds using this flask, and on longer boss fights, which there shouldn't be any at this point, they will run out if you don't have enough damage or the bosses have too much defenses. like maximum life with increased elemental resist and consecrated ground. Like, all of these just contribute sometimes. Or if you want to run some titanic strats, this could be a bit problematic to run a mana flask. Lastly, I bought a 47 Divine Voices. This actually reduced our damage but gave us defenses, opening up an additional cluster jewel for ourselves. But this is completely unnecessary for the build. You can just opt in for a normal large cluster jewel over here, which I'll also share the POB for, where you can just use a generic spell damage with some spell block on the build, or you can opt for chaos damage classes for a little bit more damage. And that is the summary of the build. And the future ideas that I'm thinking of is getting the Evasion ES mastery, switching up Profane Proxy, using something like a Blasphemy Aura, which will give us a very good right ring slot to give us more defenses. Getting a 1P Voices, possibly, ES Cluster, which I'm currently using, an ES Light of Meaning, or a Chaos Light of Meaning for damage or defense, depending. And I'm looking for an Impossible Escape with Ghost Reaver, possibly, and being able to skip these points over here. And last but not least, an Utmost, which is something I'm trying to POB, but I can't find a good solution for, because losing the amulet loses like 10 million damage, and it's not something that I'm willing to drop at this point. So last but not least, I'm going to jump into an Uber boss fight, and I'm just going to show you a very quick Uber boss over here, and I'm going to do an Uber Eater, because no one wants to sit and watch me do an Uber Shaper for the next however long that takes. So just switching a Flask to Topaz Flask gives us some max resist, which gives us some flexibility in being able to deal with that, the different bosses that you're going to fight. And that is an example of an Uber fight. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, remember to like, sub, and if you want to see more content like this, do catch me on my stream on twitch.tv/aeroplane. I'll be streaming fairly often. So if you have any questions, drop by, say hi, and see you guys there. Thanks so much for watching.